Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in to our monthly introduction to OpenNebula Operations Training webinar. As usual, uh, my name is Alex, and feel free to message in the chat with something if I'm audible. For example, you can send an exclamation mark, maybe just hi or something like that. So I know that my screen is perfectly visible and I'm perfectly audible. Good, good, good. Thank you, Raul. Thanks and welcome. Okay, so um, I'm going to start the session. So if you have any questions regarding the topic that is being covered today, feel free to leave them in the chat and or in the comment section, and I'll be answering them once I'm done with this one. Good. So let's begin. Now, what we're going to cover today is Sunstone, right? So we are going to learn what the Sunstone is, how to access it, depends on how you install that. Then we're going to talk about some user settings, kind of brief introduction into these settings, the most important ones, right? Then we go through the virtual networks and virtual networking, like what are the standards we support and um, what are the different things you can configure when it comes to virtual networking. We are going to touch marketplaces and apps. So, what is the marketplace, right? What are the apps and how to use them? Then, obviously, we are going to talk about the virtual machine templates. And in the end of the day, we are going to install or deploy the virtual machine. Um, so if you're following along, then make sure you have your OpenNebula opened somewhere nearby so you can follow along. In case you missed something, no worries. The session is being recorded, so you will be able to watch this one later. So let's dive in. First one is the Sunstone, right? So what if you go into the documentation, you are going to come across the name Sunstone. So what the Sunstone actually is? Well, that's the name of our web-based graphical user interface. Now, this one typically listens on a 2616, although you can change it and make it listen on a standard port like 80, right? And if it's not proxied, then you should use 2616. However, if you installed your OpenNebula using the Mini One evaluation tool, then this one is being listened on the port 80. So in case you've installed from Mini One and you would like to access the web interface, then you would need to go directly to the standard HTTP port. Now, but if you've installed Sunstone and OpenNebula in any other way, for example, using one deploy or with the old-fashioned packages, then the Sunstone is going to listen on 2616. That is quite important. So note that when you are going to operate your OpenNebula. Now it has the built-in one-time passcodes, multi-factor authentication support, so you don't need any specific provider. You can use whatever you have. For example, Google Authenticator, or maybe Bitwarden, LastPass. I mean, whatever you're using and whatever can read QR codes and then generate the codes, you can go with it. So you don't need anything else. And for now, it's the same for any user of OpenNebula. So if you're the administrator, or if you're just a cloud user, or maybe if you're a user with a little bit higher privileges, then you will use Sunstone. The same Sunstone has the entry points on that. There are no multiple web-based graphical user interfaces. However, the view is going to be a bit different. Depends on what is your user type or what was set up by the administrator. Now, during this session, we assume that we are using the top tier administrator called OneAdmin. So this user has access to pretty much everything, and these, I like to say that it's like the almighty capabilities in the scope of OpenNebula. So you cannot limit that user. You cannot apply any restrictions to that user, and this user can can add whatever the user wants. So it's also a note to be very careful who is part of that OneAdmin group and who's using OneAdmin user, because, well, that's pretty much kings from the kingdom. Okay, so as I mentioned, if you've installed from using the Mini One evaluation tool, then you should listen on the port 80, and that's the one that I have right now. So this one is listening on the port 80 standard HTTP port. So the username is, in my case, OneAdmin. I haven't altered anything, and if you install from Mini One, then you are going to have OneAdmin in anyways. Now, when you install from Mini One, the password is either set up during the deployment, so you should provide it inline, or the password is randomly generated and then printed out. So this is also something to be worth taking into the consideration. So, like, hey, where's my password? Well, your password is printed out in the console. Now, I'm also running the latest 7.01 version of OpenNebula. So it contains all the latest fixes, all the latest functions, security patches, and so on and so forth. Now, as soon as you logged in as OneAdmin, you have the graphical web UI with 4 shortcuts, and on the left you have the panel with various configurables and various tabs. Now this one operates in a dark mode because it uses whatever my system is configured to. However, I would prefer it to switch to the light mode because it's a little bit better for streaming. Of course, you do you. So you can select either full-on bright mode or full-on dark mode, or, as I typically do, the one that adapts to the system, right? So if you've landed and you have 4 shortcuts, each shortcut leads to a specific section. Obviously, we have much more, but these are the most popular ones. So to access your virtual machines, to access your virtual machine templates, to access your images, and the virtual networks. So these 4 shortcuts are right here. However, I've mentioned before, just a couple of minutes ago, that this slightly going to change depends on your permissions. And by permissions right now, I mean the things called views, right? You know, OpenNebula comes with 4 views, 4 default views. There is the cloud view, the user view, the group admin view, and the admin view. So these 4 are default, and you actually can create your own views. Not using the graphical UI, you would need to do a little bit of command line stuff, but it's possible, right? So we have a documentation for that, and it's pretty much straightforward. You need to make sure that the permissions are there. You need to make sure that the ownership is correct, and you need to make sure that you just follow the manual, because, I mean, as I said, it's pretty much a simple task. The only thing, it kind of requires a command line access, and that's something that you may be missing, so you would need to request that one. However, by default, we have total of 4 views, and the least one is the cloud view, right? So the cloud view is also the one that will have a different dashboard. Have you seen? I just switched from the admin view to the cloud view, and my dashboard just like changed instantly, right? So that is because the cloud view user has the specific dashboard. If we go up the hill and switch to the user view or switch to the group admin view, you can see that the dashboard itself remains containing these 4 shortcuts. So Cloud View has that specific dashboard. Now, what else changes? If you will look on the left panel, so let me expand a couple of these, right? So if you look at the left panel, this one is going to change, depends on the view as well. So we go to cloud, you see it shrunk by a heavy margin. Then we go to the user, so it adds a couple of tabs to the access, but then we go back to the admin view, and this one has the access to every tab. Now, it's worth to mention though, the views is not just to limit something, but it's actually to declutter the web interface, right? Because, for example, if I'm a simple cloud user, right, and my goal here is just deploy VMs, manage my VMs, and then remove VMs, right? I don't need to have access to ACLs, which is the advanced user management functionality. Now, if I'm going there as the one admin user, the almighty, then I have access without any issues. However, if I don't have permissions to view ACLs and this tab is visible to me, then I will click and either, well, obviously, I'll get an empty page plus also warning that I don't have permissions to do so. So why you should even have this tab visible to you if you don't have access to do so? Now, the primary goal of the views is not to kind of adjust the permissions, but the primary goal here is to declutter your web interface and only keep the important stuff there. So consider that when you thinking about views, because if your user, for example, you have only cloud view access, so you don't have an access to so-called images, right? But image tab is missing. However, if I will go into the command line and my user has permissions to view images, with the command line, I would be able to do that. So views are only affecting the graphical UI. Keep that in mind. So because permissions and view are a bit different things and they serve different purpose. So don't mix them, please. Right. Considering that, let me go back to my admin view as the fully functional one. And then you have the settings. So settings is your individual user settings, right? So you can, well, adjust the theme as I've mentioned here, right? So you can select the one you wish. You can adjust the data table styles, right? So either they are cards or you more prefer lists instead, number of rows, so basically the pagination. And also you can pin the sidebar. Now, some of you obviously would prefer the sidebar to go in and out whenever you need. Some of you may just pin it and then it's always going to be there. So quite a useful thing. Then if we go to security, what's important here is the secure shell public key. So whenever you deploy a virtual machine, the secure shell public key of that user who deploys the VM will be automatically added to the authorized keys on that target virtual machine. So you can access this virtual machine using the secure shell directly from your computer. Now, that is something that is already there because we've installed using Mini1. Mini1 create, obviously, OpenNebula creates one admin user, and Mini1 installation populates the secure shell public key automatically. However, all your new users are going to have the secure shell public key empty. So each user will be responsible to enroll their own secure shell public key to their user. Otherwise, the VM will be created, but without their public key. So the only way how they can access it is, well, using the VNC or alter the secure shell settings on that VM. So probably if you're writing any guide for your users, then that would be the step one that they need to do once they got into the OpenNebula, is to configure their secure shell public key and obviously scroll all the way down and register the authentication app. So basically enable the MFA. So these two things, I would say, are the most important things that your user should do once granted with the access to the Sunstone. And also, if your user is planning to use API or allowed to use API, then instead of using the password, well, generate a token and then use the token instead. So once again, a useful feature, but this one is, well, pretty much if you never ever going to use APIs, write some custom scripts and so on and so forth, there is literally no point in creating this token. Good. So we've logged in. We have all our cool stuff. OpenNebula is running. What we would like to have, we would like our virtual machines to be able to network, right? Either, well, at least between themselves, obviously, but we also would like some of them to be able to communicate with the World Wide Web. So for that, we have virtual networks functionality, and OpenNebula supports different standards that are very common across the data centers, but not only data centers, well, across the home users and across the enterprise and across the public and private cloud. So these are pretty much the standards that you can find. Now, there are different ways, and I tend to say that there is no A better than B. There is just A is more suitable right now than the B, for example, and so on and so forth. So that means that every standard obviously is serves its needs and its use cases. Now, the plainest and the easiest one would be bridge or bridge with security groups. That's pretty much a plain network, no VLAN isolation, no overlay with a VXLAN, and so on and so forth. The most simplistic one, right? And it comes in two variations. There's bridge or bridge with security groups. So let's take security groups for a minute. Security group or security groups is the functionality of a firewall that will be performed by the host, so by the hypervisor. Now, this functionality will is going to use IP tables for that to filter out the traffic. Now, it's a good functionality, but you need to know that if you are planning to use security groups, then you will need to go with the bridge with security group, VXLAN, or .1Q, right? So if you are planning to use the OpenNebula's functionality of the host level firewall, then you are limited to these three types of networking. Aside of that, we do support OpenVSwitch, either OpenVSwitch or with the VXLAN. We do support VXLAN itself, and we also support the VLANs or .1Q implementation, right? So all your networking settings are under the networks, and that's where you can, well, configure your security groups, obviously, but that's also where you configure your virtual networks. By default, if you installed from Mini1, then you are going to have the default virtual network with the tag FW. Now, FW stands for firewall, which means actually bridge with security groups, right? So let's say if you are going to use command line, then you will be more familiar with these shorthands of the driver. Now we have our virtual network, but obviously we can create as many virtual networks as we need to. And the only thing that we need to do in the first place is to give it some kind of a name, and that would be, for example, private network. Now, the cluster, well, OpenNebula can operate with so-called clusters. It's when you shape your virtual environment or shape your environment in a specific fashion, and you can separate some of physical hypervisors and their functionality uh, from the others. Now, by default, everything falls into that default cluster, right? So we have the default cluster where all your where all your resources are going to be by default. Now, for now, we don't need to select anything. However, if you're planning to create this virtual network and attach it to a different cluster, then you will need to select it from this drop down. We can leave it empty, and then we will use the default cluster. Right here, that's where you need to pick the driver. So your virtual network can be of a one driver at the time. So then you should select the one you wish. Now, the form down below will depend on what is the driver, right? So because different network functionalities, different network implementations, they require different configuration to be supplied. So for example, if we speaking of the .1q, then the virtual LAN ID is the one that you need to pick, right? For example, if we're speaking of bridged, then nothing is mentioning VLAN right here. Now, if we look, there is one interesting toggle here that's called use private host networking, right? Or user defined bridge. So what it means that, so when you create a virtual network, you need to attach it to some kind of physical device. So your physical network card that you have on the hypervisor. It could be ATH0, right? It could be ENS2. It could be, well, whatever. Now, the thing is, if you're planning to keep the traffic on the host only, so not allow it to go out, or you're planning to route it in any other way, then you can toggle this one. So then you, for example, you have a specific package for routing and switching and so on and so forth. So if you're planning to do so, then you can toggle this box. Or if you would like to keep the traffic on the same host and not allowing it to go out. So there are use cases when this is very useful. So toggle this this switch, and then you are good to go. Otherwise, you will need to point to a specific ATH device on your hypervisor, right? And since this is the virtual network that will be used across multiple hypervisors, aka across multiple physical hosts, you need to make sure that the naming is common across all the hypervisors that are going to use this virtual network, right? So if it's ATH0, then all your hypervisors that are using this virtual network should have the physical device with this name. So that is something to keep in mind, obviously. So for now, I'm going to create a private host networking because I'm not planning to allow this network to go anywhere outside. So for me, this toggle is fine. Right. So then the next is very important thing, the address range, right? So whenever you create a virtual machine and then you attach a virtual network card to that virtual machine, then you're placing this virtual network card into a specific network. So into a specific virtual network. Now, this virtual network card should receive an address, right? And this address can be either IPv4, IPv6, something combined, IPv4 and v6, or the Ethernet. right? MAC address, in other words. The thing is, you can create a virtual network without any address range. It's fine. But as soon as you will try to put a virtual network card into that virtual network, you're going to receive an error, right? Because there are no addresses. So the bare minimum would be obviously the Ethernet type of the address range, which just only gives you the MAC addresses, and that's it. In the best case scenario, obviously IP based network range when you would like to OpenNebula to also configure the IP addresses. Now, which one to pick, right? Should I pick IPv4 v6 or should I go with Ethernet? That depends how you're planning to configure and distribute those IP addresses. If you're planning to use an external DHCP server, then you should go with the Ethernet type of the range. If you're planning to configure your IP addresses statically, aka static assignment, then you should point out the IP v4 and then define the range, or IPv6 or combined, right? But that basically means that your virtual network card on the virtual machine will be in the static mode, and the IP address will be configured using the OpenNebula management. Pretty much something that you would do otherwise manually by logging into that virtual machine and configuring all that manually. Well, we have the tools to do that, so you don't need to go through all these hoops. So you only need to define the address range, and then the IP address will be assigned and configured on the VM. Now, let me define something like 192.168.20.20, and then the size would be 100 unique IP addresses. So your address range can be also disjointed, right? So for example, I have these 100 IP addresses, but for whatever reason, there is something in the middle. So I cannot use, for example, the 25th IP address, or 45th, right? So what I can do instead, I can instead create, let's say, 24 or 25 IP addresses, right? Then create another range with the same type, right? IPv4, and another, let's say, 20 IP addresses, and then skip that IP or these IPs that are occupied with whatever, something on a network, maybe some physical device, some box that I cannot reconfigure, or reconfiguring that would be quite a painful thing. So if I need to skip one in between, well, no worries, you can create multiple ranges. Now, security groups, that's where you select your security group. So I would like to urge you, there's a default security group that allows everything in and everything out. If you're planning to leverage the security group functionality, make sure this one's not selected. Otherwise, all your efforts in crafting your security groups are down the drain, right? Because this effectively going to allow everything. Now, quality of service, if you need to configure any quality of service for the inbound or outbound traffic, that's where you do it. And then we go to the context tab, which is no less important than the other things, right? So the context, that's where you define the gateway. That's where you define the DNS if it needs to, right? The MTU of the guest interface in case you are using something like VXLAN, for example, where you would need to lower down the MTU. And which is very important bit, the method, right? So the method means how would you like to configure this virtual network card that are placed in this virtual network. So you have options like DHCP, meaning external DHCP, like skip. That's completely skipping any of the configurations, so does not going to configure any IPv4, while this one is placing the virtual network card into the automatic mode or DHCP mode. Then this one just skips the entire configuration of the IPv4, and in case of IPv6, IPv6, or static. So static means that the virtual network card will be switched into a static mode and the IP address will be configured according to the addresses, right? Address pool. So static is the default setting, right? So if you're not configuring anything, then you are going to proceed with this static method. So keep this in mind and plan it obviously accordingly. You can update your network later, you can reconfigure it, but it's just something to think of to avoid some unnecessary surprises. Good. So the private network was added, and then we can see that there are a total of 45 IP addresses available, and none of them is in use. Now we have the virtual network, so the one that we have here. And if we go to attributes, we can see its configuration. And well, what we can see right here is that this virtual network is also of the private type. However, if you installed it from Mini1, then Mini1 routes the traffic in a different way, right? So it performs NAT and uh, uh, the other routing using the IP tables effectively. So that's why this virtual network also, if we will go into the update mode, right? So you will see that there is the private host networking toggle ticked. So that is something also to be aware of if you're using Mini1 to evaluate OpenNebula, that this default virtual network has its own way of routing the traffic. Right. So these attributes also is the way how you can quickly override some of the configurations. So for example, the DNS is set to 172.16.101, which may not be the best scenario since some of the cloud providers, and I'm kind of running my stuff in the cloud right now. So some cloud providers, they don't like some bogus DNS devices to be in their network and may somehow control or restrict the DNS traffic. So what I would like to do, I would like to change the DNS to 4 ones, right? I could do it by going into the update mode and then go to the context section and change it there, or I can just quickly access and change these things in the attributes. So quite a good thing to have. And then last but not least, what you could do also with your network, so you can create a smaller piece, a smaller chunk of your virtual network by creating the reservation and then give this smaller chunk to other users to use if you don't want them to use the main network. So this reservation, though, is going to take or occupy uh, a certain amount of IP addresses from its parent network, and this will prevent the parent network from being deleted, right? So as soon as you have at least one lease in the in this virtual network, it doesn't matter how you add it. It's a virtual net, like a reservation, or it's a virtual machine, or even if you if you placed an IP on hold, this is going to prevent this virtual network from being deleted, right? So in order to delete a virtual network, your virtual network must be completely empty. So all the virtual network cards that are using this virtual network should be released and, well, start using another network or whatever. Good. We also have the network templates. So this one is when you are planning to give your users an ability to create virtual networks themselves. So you can define some kind of a template with all the settings predefined and give them a template. So whenever they need to, they can create their own networks. So we were speaking about virtual networks, we were speaking about virtual machines and virtual machine templates and so on and so forth. Well, what's the whole point of having virtual networks configured without virtual machines, right? Then, of course, where to get those virtual machines and how to deploy virtual machines? Well, obviously, you can go the old fashioned way, is deploy an empty virtual machine and then install the operating system, right? That is, well, that's a very standardized way across the virtualization. However, OpenNebula is to build, well, a private cloud, right? It's not just to virtualize some workloads, but it actually is much more. And the idea is that you're not going to install a operating system every time you need to, right? So what you're going to do, you're going to take some snapshot, right? Some disk image, and will deploy it. And that's it. And you have a running VM with operating system of your choice in a matter of seconds. Now, for that, you would need images. So image would be a snapshot of a disk. Now, in image, although is just a small puzzle of the whole virtual machine, right? So you have the network mappings, you have some fine tunings for the CPU, you have memory definitions, and so on and so forth. So this one is incorporated in the virtual machine template, right? But where to get all of these? Well, as I mentioned, you can build your own, right? So it's totally fine. You can create your own images. However, there is a marketplace where you can get a pre-built images, right, that are ready to run and be managed by OpenNebula. Because what makes an image the OpenNebula image? Well, if you roam around the internet, you will find that there are a lot of cloud images supplied to you by Ubuntu, by Alma Linux, by Debian, by SUSE, and so on and so forth. Now, what they're going to miss is the contextualization package, pretty much a thin layer that allows this virtual machine or this image to be managed by OpenNebula, which gives you a lot of the automation possibilities. You can, for example, set up the time zone or set up the sudo user or set up the administrator user or set up the password or set up the host name or run some custom script on every start. So that is the part that you can do using OpenNebula without logging into the VM. But in order to do that, you need that contextualization package. So the marketplace is the source of these images that are ready to be managed and deployed on the OpenNebula environment. Marketplaces can be public, can be private, and also can be community. So the public marketplaces, there is one big that comes obviously as the part of the OpenNebula deployment, and that is the OpenNebula Public. However, we also have the community marketplace with the community submitted images that are also ready to be used on the OpenNebula environment. Right. So your images that you can download are accessible under the apps. So you go into the apps, and here are the images that you may run. So, for example, let's look for Alma. Let's pick this one and let's import that. So, in order to use it, you need to download it from our marketplace and place it into your environment. So, you press import. What you can see right here, you have two names. You have the name for the image, but also majority of the images from the marketplace, they contain the template as well. And remember, template is very important because template is the blueprint for your virtual machine. So you need this template. That's why I would recommend this one to be toggled unless you need to do it otherwise. So right here, what you can set the name for an image and you can set the name for the template, right? So these two are separate entities. Even though they're packed right now, once you've imported that into your OpenNebula, these two entities are completely separate. They have a thin link between them, like the mapping, and that's it. But they are separate and managed separately. So in order to store your image, you need to place it onto a data store with a tag image or with a type image data store. Image data store, that's where your image is at rest. So it means that the virtual machine is not using that image at the moment. Once you're deploying virtual machine from this image, then the clone of that image will end up in the systems data store, right? But of course, we need to place it onto the image data store because for now, the image goes to the place where it will be just simply stored. So you click finish and you get the pop-up window with the image ID and the virtual machine template ID. So, right, these two things right here. Now, the image may take more time to download. That's why it remains in the state locked, right? Because it's actually a snapshot of a disk. It can be 500 megs, 1 gig, couple of gigs, 10 gigs, depends on what is on that image, right? However, the virtual machine templates is actually just a bunch of text, right? A bunch of variables and variable mappings. That's why this one will be already there as soon as you will click import. The image, how quickly you can get this one, heavily depends on the size, your disk speed, and your and your uh, network speed, right? Accidentally muted myself. Right. So what else you can do here is you can look into um, you can look into a specific image either using the command line or you can use this image look into that image using the web UI, right? So once again, whatever is your preference, that is up to you. Now, so the virtual machine template, as I've mentioned, the virtual machine template is a set of images, right? A set of virtual network cards, and the parameters or fine tuning of each virtual image or each virtual network card. Because when you're adding the image, when you're adding a disk to a virtual machine, you can set a different size, right? So if your initial image is 10 gigs, you can make it 20 on the deployment or 30. The same with virtual network, right? So it may contain some of the overrides. And multiple virtual machine templates can use the same image, right? So you say your image can be just generic Alma Linux, but then you can have multiple virtual machine templates with different settings that serve completely different needs, right? And then we have so-called services, and services, they are going to use virtual machine templates underneath, right? So it is kind of important here. So if we go to the virtual machine templates, you can find that we have two, right? So the one that came by default using the mini one, and one that we've just downloaded, the Alma Linux 9, right? So we can update it, right? We can change the memory, right? we can change the disk. So for example, go to edit and then set it to be 20 gigs instead of 10 on the deployment, attach the virtual network card, right, to a specific virtual network. We can also use some kind of an automation to give OpenNebula a flexibility to pick the virtual network. But in general, right, so for the sake of simplicity right now, I'm going to place it into a specific virtual network, right? So, and then the context, which is the way how you can fine tune the fine tune the image once it's getting deployed. So, for example, under the context custom variables, you can set the time zone to something like Europe, Riga, right? So, or you can set host name and then set it to Alma instead of the local host. Now, with the context custom variables, there are two things, right? So the first thing is that it can be whatever you wish, right? But then there is a bunch of custom context variables that are going to trigger a specific logic of the contextualization package, right? And are going to perform the specific actions, a set of specific actions. So, for example, setting the time zone or setting the host name, as well as, for example, username to tux instead of root. So this user will end up as the sudoer. So this user will be added to the sudoers list and will be able to execute sudo without a password, right? So, and here we go. We've saved that virtual machine template. And now, well, what we need to do is to deploy a virtual or instantiate a virtual machine template. We can do it from multiple places, right? From the template section or from the VM section. So from the VM section, just press plus, and that effectively pretty much gives you the list of your virtual machine template. So whatever is your preferred way, it's up to you. I find that VM templates could be a little bit easy because you have all your virtual machine templates right in front of you. So that pretty much kind of gives you one step less. However, once again, whatever floats your boat is the way you should go. So when you instantiate a virtual machine template, what you can do, you can change some of the settings, right? So for example, instead of this amount of memory, I can raise it to 1 gig instead, right? Then what else I can do? I can deploy the X amount of instances, right? So instead of 1, I can deploy, let's say, 5 number of the samely configured virtual machines. And this will take all my overrides, right? So it's not going to deploy one with 1 gig and then 3 or 4 others with, the default memory capacity. No, they will be samely configured. So, which is a very nice thing if you need to deploy at the bulk, right? So let's set 2. Then obviously the name, if I'm not going to change anything, then the virtual machine name will be Alma Linux dash and then unique ID. However, I can change it to something different if I need to, right? So next, and then click finish, and this will initiate the virtual machine deployment, right? So you can see the exclamation mark right here. No worries. I have only one host, and our specific process scheduler places one virtual machine per host in the scheduled action. That's why, well, just need to wait for the next scheduled action to kick in. This one can be changed. You can fine tune it, but by default, in one scheduling action, we will deploy one virtual machine to one single host. So obviously, if I would have two hosts, then these two virtual machines would be placed simultaneously. But since I have only one, I need two scheduling actions. Okay, my virtual machines are running, so I can open the VNC connection and access the terminal window, right? Um, or I can start managing my virtual machines. So, for example, I can change its state, right? So I can reboot the virtual machine, I can undeploy the virtual machine, or I can power it off, or, well, I can terminate it if I no longer need that, right? So what else I can have here? I can have the IP address of my virtual machine, right? I'm receiving this one because OpenNebula is managing the virtual networks and IP addresses for this virtual machine. That's why I can have uh, the IP address available right in the graphical UI. Good. What else you can do? You can obviously take snapshots of the whole virtual machine, right? By just pressing this one, right? Then you can go to storage and you can snapshot the individual disks. You can resize the individual disks, or you can save the disk as an image. This one is very important, right? So you see, by the nature of OpenNebula, when you deploy a virtual machine, you made some changes on this virtual machine and then you destroy the virtual machine. So when you destroy this virtual machine, all the changes that you made with this virtual machine are gone, right? So that includes, well, whatever software you've installed. But what if you would like to save it, right, and then reuse it in the future? For example, you're crafting your own image, right? So you're enhancing the ones that we're distributing and you're adding your security. Maybe you add some SE Linux policies, or maybe you would like to add some additional software. Then just simply click Save As and save it as custom image, right? So this is something that, well, you effectively can do, right? You can resize. Let's say if you're coming close to filling up the disk, you can resize the disk and make it 40 gigs, right? So once again, you have this flexibility right here. And when it comes to networking, you can attach multiple network cards. You can detach network cards. And what else? You can attach a security group, right? So this one is very important because sometimes you may end up, well, debugging the networking on your virtual machine. And well, sometimes it may be a security group. It may be too restrictive, or for whatever reason, you, for example, cannot access your application from the network. So one of the options, you can go and, well, attach the default security group to that and make sure that these are not security groups. Or alternatively, you may actually figure out that these were the security groups, right? So you need to go and change in configuration of your security groups to make sure that now they work. So that is very handy because you obviously can change those security groups at the network, but then it's going to update all the virtual network cards that are attached to this network. But you need to troubleshoot one specific virtual machine only. So that's why you can make these changes on that VM only. And as well as you have this configuration tab. So configuration tab, that's where you can change, for example, the same time zone, or change the username, right? Or change the host name. So instead of logging in directly to your virtual machine, you can manage it using these contextualization parameters. You just need to update the VM configuration. However, right here, it's very important to know what's your view, right? So if we go to Cloud View, you can see that Cloud View is actually missing this configuration settings, right? So you actually need the admin or user or group admin view in order to access these configurations. So, for example, you update the VM configuration, you go to the context, right, and you set the username from the tux to Alma, right? And this is going to trigger the internal logic of the contextualization package to swap the user. The user will not be deleted, right? So the user tux will remain on that virtual machine. However, this user is no longer going to be a pseudo user. So the pretty much the administrative permissions of that user are going to get removed. And now the Alma user is in charge. And then when you no longer need these virtual machines, you can terminate them, right? And they are gone. As simple as that. Right. So, and that brings us to the questions section. So, do we have any questions there? Earth, hello. Hi. So, demonstrate by opening one image. What you would like to open, if you could elaborate it a little bit, then I would be able to demonstrate uh, what actually uh, what actually you would like to ask. Well, I don't see any any follow up on that. So unfortunately, I cannot um, demonstrate or uh, open something that I don't know. Are there any other questions? Obviously, once again, the session is recorded, so you can rewatch it later. If you need some assistance from the community, feel free to go to our forum. And then the problem that you're facing might be already solved by someone in the community. Or, well, if it's not there, then you just can create a new question and get this one resolved, right? Then, obviously, follow up. We have other webinars in the pipeline on different topics, from ranging from a basic introduction like this one to a more complex, more interesting like AI or the new functionality with Veeam and so on and so forth. So there is quite a plenty of things that we cover in this webinar. So make sure you're signed up and are notified. And obviously, um, attend other training webinars to, well, learn more about practicality of OpenNebula. Right. So I hope it was useful. I see no questions. Then thanks for attending. It was a pleasure, and see you next time.